You open this garage right now, my car is stuck in there. Claudia Veyron, the HOA president in a blindingly bright suit, was screaming like the whole neighborhood ought to kneel at her feet. But I just gave a cold smile and hit the remote, locking the door shut. Your car? It'll sit there for 10 days. The entire community went silent, and I knew right then. Sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom. It comes from the guts to stand up to someone who tramples on other people's dignity. I turned onto the familiar street, the late afternoon sun casting a golden hue across the row of trees lining the path. That day, my mood was light after a long day at work, and all I wanted was to get home, pour myself a small glass of wine, and sit with my daughter in the living room. But that sense of relief shattered the moment my car rolled into the driveway. The garage, usually spotless and tidy, was now completely taken over by a silver Mercedes. The door stood ajar, shamelessly, as if the homeowner had given permission. My blood rushed to my temples because the garage is the most private space in the house, and yet someone had the audacity to treat it like a public parking lot. I stopped the car and stepped out, a tightness catching in my throat. From the shadow inside the garage, a woman emerged. Her hair was gleaming blonde, meticulously styled, and her face was carefully made up as if heading into a board meeting. Her light-colored suit clung sharply to her figure, exuding a smug confidence. She twirled a set of keys in her hand, clinking sound deliberately loud, like a challenge. She looked at me with the calm detachment of someone addressing a nuisance. You're new to this neighborhood, aren't you? Her voice was syrupy but biting, each word laced with superiority. This is my parking spot, just for now. I took a deep breath to stay composed, but my throat burned with anger. I spoke slowly, my words cold and deliberate. This is my garage. What gives you the right to do this? Her eyes lit up with a flicker of satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for that exact line to start the game. I'm Claudia Veyron, she said, lifting her chin, president of the HOA. Around here, I decide what's reasonable. I stood frozen for a few seconds, not out of fear, but out of disbelief at the sheer boldness. I had moved in less than 2 months ago, heard vague mentions about the HOA, but never imagined this woman would feel entitled to barge into a neighbor's garage. I replied calmly, that title doesn't come with keys to my house. I never signed anything giving you permission to park here. Claudia scoffed. Her smile wasn't friendly. It was like a dull blade dragged across skin. You should know, she said, lowering her voice just enough to make sure every passerby still heard clearly. This garage is nicer than that worn-out car of yours. My car actually fits the value of this house. My blood heated. In my mind flashed the image of my late wife and the years we both worked ourselves to the bone just to afford this home. Every dollar came from sweat and sacrifice, not from smug looks and imaginary entitlements like hers. I answered, voice sharp as glass. I bled and sweated for this property. Your car doesn't elevate it. It only dirties. Claudia narrowed her eyes and exhaled with a mocking chuckle. The way you talk just proves you don't understand how things work around here. This neighborhood isn't for just anyone. People look at your home, how you live, and they judge the whole community. Parking my car in your garage, at the very least, makes the neighbors feel like this place has standards. I clenched my fist, the veins rising on the back of my hand. This was no longer mere rudeness. It was a slap to my dignity. I knew exactly what she was implying. I was one of the few people of color in a neighborhood filled with wealthy, powerful families. To Claudia, my presence was likely already a thorn, and now she wanted to stomp on that thorn to prove her authority. I stepped forward, keeping my voice steady but tight with restraint. Don't get it twisted. This isn't your stage to play out some petty show of prejudice. I paid in full to live here, and you will not park a single wheel in this garage ever again. Claudia raised an eyebrow, her eyes flashing with defiance. You think you can stand against me? I've run this place for over 10 years. Everyone listens to me, everyone follows my lead. And you're just the new guy who doesn't know how the game works. I put my car in your garage. That's a privilege. You should be grateful. I let out a laugh, short and cutting. A privilege? Your so-called privilege is an insult to everyone else. If the rules of this place mean bowing down to someone arrogant, then I'll be the one who breaks them. She froze for a beat, then quickly reclaimed her superior posture. Claudia turned on her heel, tossing one last remark over her shoulder. You'll regret this. Her heels struck the concrete floor with a sharp thud, driving her threat into the air. I watched her silhouette disappear, the heavy scent of her perfume still lingering, mixing with the cold tang of steel and concrete in the garage. Choking sense of fury rose in my chest, but at the same time, fire lit inside me. This would not be a passive fight. I wasn't going to let a self-declared authority walk all over me and my family. That night, I sat with my daughter, trying to keep my smile steady so she wouldn't notice the anger eating away at me. But when she asked, Dad, why do some people think they have the right to do things like that? I knew that silence silence would only mean surrender. I ran my hand through her hair and answered, "Some people think they're above the law, but eventually they get trapped in the very net they set for others." That answer wasn't just for her. It was a promise to myself. I wasn't letting that arrogance slide. This first clash was just the beginning of a much tougher confrontation, and I was ready. Claudia stood at the entrance to the driveway, her eyes gleaming with showy confidence. She crossed her arms over her chest and held her head high as if about to deliver a formal address. "I'm Claudia Veyron, president of the HOA. Around here, I decide what's reasonable." Each word landed like a verdict, leaving no room for rebuttal. I stared straight at her, swallowing the anger that had just flared up. I knew her type, clinging to a title as if it granted her a power far beyond its scope. Elsewhere, an HOA position meant managing minor tasks, but to Claudia, it was a throne from which she ruled the entire neighborhood. She narrowed her eyes, her voice lowering with clear intent. "Where are you from? This neighborhood isn't for just anyone." The question sounded casual, almost caring, but I caught the deliberate emphasis aimed squarely at my back. I saw the glance swept over my skin, the way she tried to make feel out of place. I pressed my lips together, choosing my words carefully. "I come from a place where the law is respect, and this garage belongs to me. No one gets to judge what's acceptable here." My voice was calm, but every word carried weight. I needed her to know that her tempt couldn't touch my self-respect. Claudia let out a soft chuckle, dripping with mockery. "You're very confident, but here, things operate the way I set. People trust my taste, my ability to keep this neighborhood clean, safe, and upscale." She paused, her eyes lighting up with smug satisfaction. "As for you, maybe ask yourself if you truly belong here." A wave of fury surged inside me. No one had the right to question my worth, least of all through veiled jab. I stepped closer, lowering my voice to avoid turning this into a loud argument, but each word came out like a blade. "You can keep that title for those willing to let you boss them around. Don't try to use it on me. This garage, this house, is a part of the life I've worked myself to the bone to build. No one gets to turn it into a stage for their power." Claudia smirked, her smile filled with scorn. She tilted her head as if humoring a defiant child. "You think raising your voice makes you stronger? What people care about here is class, not hard work. And trust me, no one in this neighborhood wants to see your rough attitude ruin the refined image I've created." Those words hit like a blade to the chest, aimed not just at me, but at everyone like me. It was clear she was using language as a weapon of exclusion, pressing the idea that I didn't belong. I took a deep breath, suppressing every bit of heat inside me to keep my tone level, but laced with warning. "The luxury you brag about is hollow, because if this place were truly high class, people would respect their neighbors, not steal their garages." She paused for a brief moment, then her eyes lit up like fire, and her smile turned sharper. "You'll learn soon enough that in this place, people who don't follow the rules don't last, and I'll be the one to teach you that lesson." I kept my gaze locked on hers, making sure she saw I wasn't afraid. I answered plainly, "We'll see who learns the lesson from whom." I stood still for a few seconds, forcing down the surge of anger rising in my chest. My reply rang out clear. "The only standard I know is that I bought this house legally. I didn't need to prove anything else. The ownership papers said it all." But Claudia didn't care about fact. All she cared about was flaunting her power. She let out a short, scornful laugh, as if I'd just said something stupid. "Someone like you should know their place. This garage looks better with my car in it, not yours." Her voice dripped with arrogance, every word meant to bury me in contempt. I furrowed my brow, my eyes locked on the smug smile spreading across her lip. In that moment, I saw the truth clearly. Claudia didn't see me as a neighbor, didn't see me as part of this community. In her mind, I was an outsider, someone who didn't belong. Her words weren't just meant to belittle me. They were a label slapped on my entire family, a declaration that we weren't worthy of being here. I stepped forward slowly, keeping my voice steady. "Whether my car is old or new has nothing to do with you. This house and this garage are mine. They're not here for anyone else to showcase their wealth." I knew my words wouldn't make her back off, but at the very least, they drew a clear boundary. Claudia raised an eyebrow, her eyes lighting up with amusement as if my defiance only made her more entertained. "You think you're strong, don't you?" she said, tilting her head, her voice syrupy, taunting. "In this neighborhood, people judge by appearance. I bring value. You bring heaviness, that stubborn stench of poverty that clings like..." Hearing that, every muscle in my body tensed. She wasn't even trying to hide her prejudice anymore. The way she emphasized the contrast was a blade aimed straight at my pride. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice cold as steel. "If you think dignity can be bought with a luxury car or a bright-colored suit, you're mistaken. People judge character, and you've just stained yours." Claudia paused for a moment, then smirked with a half smile. "You'll soon realize there's no place here for the stubborn. People like you learn to bow eventually. She turned and walked away slowly, her posture soaked in challenge. I watched figure disappear, the tightness still burning in my chest. Final words felt like a declaration of war. I knew this wasn't just about a car in the garage anymore. Claudia had marked me as a target, and she wouldn't stop until she proved I was wrong to stand against. When I stepped back into the house, my chest felt heavy. My daughter was sitting at the dining table, her innocent smile hitting me with a pang of guilt. I didn't want her to see me crushed under the weight of those venomous words, but I also couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. I gently took her hand, telling myself that one day she would understand why I chose to stand tall instead of bowing down. Deep inside, I realized this was just the beginning of a long confrontation. Claudia would use everything she had, her title, her wealth, grip on the HOA, but I had something she would never understand. A sense of self-respect wasn't for sale, and once that line had been crossed, I wasn't backing down. The next morning, just as I stepped into the yard to head to work, I caught faint whispers from the neighbors. A few glances came my way, mixed with pity and caution. It didn't take long to figure out why. The murmurs were clear enough. He's selfish, doesn't know how to fit in. Those words weren't random. They bore Claudia's finger. She had already spun a new narrative, casting me as the lead in a drama she'd direct. I wheeled my car toward the gate, slowing down as more comments drifted in. A man said to his wife, "The president's right. Everyone else gets along, but he's the odd one out." I held in a sigh, realizing Claudia didn't just want a place in my garage. She wanted a place in how people saw me. Her arrogance had morphed into a full-blown smear campaign. That afternoon, I decided to attend the HOA meeting. I needed to face this head-on instead of letting the rumors spread unchecked. The community room was packed, expensive perfume mingling with polite laughter. Claudia sat at the head table, her bright-colored suit standing out, face brimming with confidence. The moment she saw me, she smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. When the meeting began, Claudia wasted no time making me the example. She stood up, her voice ringing through the room. "Some of the new residents don't understand what it means to be civilized. We built this place on mutual respect and refined conduct, but some people only think about their own interests." Her gaze landed on me, sharp as a blade. I stayed quiet, listening to the soft chuckle, the subtle nods from those too hesitant to speak up. I knew many were under Claudia's influence, used to following her lead without. I also knew that standing up and pushing back wouldn't be easy. She'd created an atmosphere where no one wanted to be labeled as difficult. Claudia continued, "I won't name names, but I'm sure everyone knows who I'm referring to. Some treat their garage like a fort, refusing to open it up for the sake of community." That line landed like a public slap. She didn't need to say my name. Every eye in the room had already turned to me. I stood, keeping my voice clear. "If you have something to say it directly. I'm the person you're referring to, and I have a right to respond. The garage is private property. No one has the right to intrude. If defending my property makes me selfish, then we've twisted the meaning of the word civilized." The room went quiet for a few seconds. I looked around and saw a frown, as if they'd just heard something uncomfortable but true. Claudia let out a dry laugh. "You're confusing personal rights, community interest. Around here, people value integration. A good resident thinks of others, not just clings to their own space." I looked her straight in the eye and answered, brief, firm, "Respecting boundaries doesn't mean being selfish. Civility begins with knowing when to stop before crossing into someone else's space." My words rang out, not with noisy anger, but with steady conviction. I wanted everyone to hear not just a rebuttal, but a reminder. Still, Claudia kept her arrogant expression. She turned to the board, her voice sharp. "You see, instead of cooperating, he chooses to argue. This is exactly what we don't want in our neighborhood." The murmurs started again. I knew this wasn't a battle I could win in one meeting, but I also noticed some eyes had changed. They were beginning to see that Claudia wasn't just defending community standards. She was using her authority to corner me. Pride had turned into a campaign of pressure and humiliation. I sat back down, the storm still churning inside me, but my mind clearer than ever. Claudia had revealed her playbook: shame, belittle, and rally the crowd. I knew I had to brace for more intense confrontations ahead, and I also knew every word I spoke today would become the foundation. Pushback come. The air in the meeting room grew dense, and every eye was locked on me. I rose slowly, letting the chair scrape against the floor with a dry, deliberate sound. My voice rang out, every word sharp. "If civility means violating private property, then you've just given us a vivid lesson in how not to behave." I didn't need to raise my voice. The sudden silence that followed made my words land like a hammer. For a moment, I saw a few faces stiffen, brows furrowed. They realized what I said wasn't without truth, but Claudia's sneering smile quickly pulled the atmosphere back to its usual tension. She clenched her jaw, her eyes flashing with fury, yet her tone stayed laced with threat. "You'll pay for defying me." That was no longer a complaint. It was a public threat in front of the entire community. She had turned the meeting into a trial, and now she used it as a stage for her warning. I met her gaze without flinching, making sure everyone saw that I wasn't afraid. In that silence, I knew I had crossed a line, from being a target to becoming her direct challenger. An older man nearby whispered to his wife, and I caught the words, "He's right, but who's going to stand up to Claudia?" That single line underscored the shadow of power she had built over the years. People knew she was controlling, knew she was wrong, but they stayed silent out of fear, and that silence was the true source of Claudia's power. I sat down, but the storm inside me had not settled. I saw every face clearly, the ones complicit with their nod, the ones afraid with their averted eye, and a few who seemed uneasy, said nothing. Together formed a familiar portrait of a community manipulated by one person. Claudia knew exactly how to leverage fear, and she had just proven it by turning a threat into a tool to solidify her position. After the meeting, as everyone stood up to leave, I could feel the scrutinizing stares following me. A few offered reluctant handshakes, a few forced smiles, but no one had the courage to voice support. Claudia stood by the door, lips pressed tightly, as if trying to carve into my mind the message that this battle had only just begun. On the way home, my thoughts raced. I couldn't let my daughter grow up in a place where dignity was this casually trampled. I also couldn't repeat the silence that so many others had chosen, because if I bowed today, tomorrow, more people would do the same. Claudia's arrogance wasn't just aimed at me, it was a noose heightening around this entire community. When I got home, I opened the garage and looked at the empty space where my car used to be. It was no longer just a place to park. It had become a symbol of a violated boundary. I knew the fight ahead would be long, but a fierce resolve rose within me. Claudia might have her title, her money, and her followers, but I had something she could never buy: truth and determination. I remembered my daughter's question from the other day, when she innocently asked why some people think they have the right to act that way. I hadn't given her a full answer then, but now I knew. The answer would come through act. She needed to see that there are lines no one is allowed to cross, no matter how powerful they believe they are. I made a promise to myself. From now on, I would no longer just defend. Every step I took would be preparation for the counter-attack. Claudia wanted to shame me into submission to send a message to the community, but she forgot one thing. When an oppressor exposes themselves too boldly, that's when resistance begins to form. If someone blatantly took over your garage, what would you do? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The weekend party was held at the community clubhouse, where residents usually gathered to eat, raise glasses, and show off their latest achievement. I showed up quietly with my daughter, just hoping to blend in and give her a pleasant evening. The atmosphere was lively but friendliest until Claudia stepped into the center of the crowd, wine glass in hand, her bright-colored suit making her stand out as if she owned the event. She raised her voice, not needing to say my name for everyone to know who she meant. People like him, always so sensitive, blowing up over a simple garage. A few chuckles rippled from those standing nearby, a sound that reeked of complicity. I saw my daughter freeze for a moment, her eyes scanning the room, confusion flickering across her face. I kept my composure, but Claudia's words pierced straight into my pride. This wasn't a personal dispute anymore. She had turned it into public ridicule. By humiliating me in front of the community, Claudia was reinforcing her image as the one who defined what was acceptable, while casting me as the troublemaker. In the crowd, laughter echoed, but I also caught a few glances thrown Claudia's way that were less than amused. Some didn't laugh at all, even shook their heads slightly, as if recognizing her behavior had crossed a line. Those looks passed quickly, and no one dared speak up, but I knew there were cracks forming in the wall of power she had. I stepped forward, raising my voice just enough to rise above the music. If your version of civility means turning a violation into a joke, then maybe it's time we rethink what civility really means. The air shifted. A few people stopped laughing and turned to look at me with entirely different eyes. Claudia hesitated for a beat, but quickly regained her confident posture. She raised an eyebrow. "You really think you can teach me about civility? You've been here for less than 2 months. I've kept this neighborhood thriving for over 10 years. Her tone sharpened, rising, aiming to stamp out any trace of defiance. I responded calmly. Thriving isn't measured by how long someone sits in a chair. Thriving begins with fairness, with knowing how to respect other people's boundaries. If you've forgotten that, then you're the one tearing it down. A brief silence spread across the room, broken only by a quiet cough somewhere in the back. I saw a few faces tilt in my direction, their eyes carrying a silent acknowledgement, even if no one dared say it aloud. But Claudia wouldn't let the moment breathe. She laughed, raising her wine glass like she'd just heard a joke. "You've got a way with words, but no one here needs pretty speeches. Around here, I define value, not you." I didn't flinch, didn't let the mocking laughter drown me out. I looked Claudia straight in the eye, my voice clear over the lingering music. "Don't use wealth as a measure of character. I bought this house with sweat and hard work." I saw my daughter's eyes light up just a little. natural, like she'd been waiting for me to say those words all along. And I noticed a few people in the crowd lower their gaze, as if embarrassed by the truth that had been said out loud. Claudia didn't flinch. She tilted slightly, her smile curling into a shape dripping with disdain. Around here, reputation matters more than sweat, and reputation is something you'll never have. The words dropped like a sentence. To her, every effort, every personal value was meaningless if it didn't come wrapped in the polished image she worshipped as the standard. The room suddenly grew heavy. Some people snickered, a few whispers floated up, all feeding into Claudia's arrogance. But I also caught other eyes that weren't fully aligned with her, eyes that seemed to question. They understood that this so-called reputation Claudia clung to was really just troll masked by fear. I didn't want her words to hang in the air like gospel. I spoke slowly, each syllable steady. Reputation might make people bow their head, but it can't hide the truth. I don't need your approval because what I have isn't for show, it's for living. I turned slightly toward the crowd, making sure they heard it too. If anyone believes dignity can be measured by a car or a suit, they've already sold themselves short. The room shifted. Some fell silent, others awkwardly changed the subject, but I could feel a new energy creeping in. Claudia still held her smile, but a small twitch at the corner of her eye gave her away. I knew I had struck a nerve. The reputation she held so proudly was a brittle wall, one that would crumble with just enough crack. She lifted her glass, her voice turning sharp. You can say whatever you want, but you're still the outsider. Everyone here knows who keeps this place shining, and clearly, it's not you, I answered plainly, my gaze steady. I don't need to be the center to see the truth, and if that shine comes at the cost of humiliation, then it's nothing more than darkness wrapped in gold. That exchange froze more than a few people. A young woman in the corner covered her mouth like she'd just heard something forbidden. A middle-aged man stared down at his drink, avoiding Claudia's gaze. No one dared speak up for me, not openly, but the silence had changed. It was no longer full consent for Claudia. It was hesitation. Claudia tried to shatter that pause with a loud, echoing laugh. She said, "You're clever, I'll give you that. Cleverness won't keep you standing. You'll see soon enough. This defiance of yours will make life very hard for you and your family here." I knew it wasn't an empty threat. Claudia was used to turning words into reality, with underhanded tact, with the HOA decisions she manipulated. But I didn't let her see fear in my eyes. I simply nodded and took my daughter's hand to leave. With every step toward the door, I could still hear laughter behind me, but layered beneath it, I knew there were also sighs. On the way home, my daughter stayed silent, then suddenly gripped my hand tightly. She didn't say a word, but that squeeze was the greatest encouragement I could have received. She understood that I had just stood up against a force much bigger than myself, and I understood that this fight wasn't just for me. It was so she would know there are things that must never be compromised. That night, I sat in the garage, staring at the empty space, replaying every word Claudia had said. She believed reputation could define everything, but I believed the truth always finds a way to break through that facade. I knew the day she would have to face the consequences wasn't far off, and I was ready to prepare for that moment, step by step. In the days following the party, I tried to stay calm, but every time I looked at the garage, my patience was tested again. The silver Mercedes sat there like a provocation, filling the space that rightfully belonged to me. I had knocked on Claudia's door multiple times, asking her to move the car. Her answer was always the same, accompanied by a half smile that made me clench my fists to stop them from shaking. "You should be grateful my car is in your garage. It makes your house classier." I repeated that my property needed no embellishment, that she had to respect private ownership. But Claudia never took my words seriously. She treated them like setups for her mockery. Once, I even heard her raise her voice just enough for the neighbors to catch. If he had any sense, he would have thanked me by now. Instead of complaining, think about it. Plenty of people wish they could have my car parked in their garage and can't. The laughter that followed those words felt like salt ground into a wound. My daughter witnessed it more than once. The moment I returned home to find the gleaming Mercedes blocking the garage, she never said anything, but I saw the disappointment in her eyes. She saw her father being pushed around in his own house, and I hated that more than any personal humiliation. I wanted her to believe that fairness still exists, but Claudia's every move chipped away at that belief. One evening, after work, I came home to the sound of loud laughter pouring from Claudia's house. Her windows were wide open, and I could hear her voice rising over the clinking of glasses. "The Mercedes is still in there. He won't dare do anything." The laughter roared, unfiltered. I stood silently in the yard, my hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my palm. I didn't want my daughter to hear those words, but they carried too clearly nearly through the night to be hidden. I stepped back and sat on the stone bench on the front porch. The streetlight cast my shadow long across the concrete, and in that shadow, I saw my own limit. I had been patient too long. I had given Claudia too many chances to stop, but she had mistaken my silence for weak. Every laugh tonight proved she truly believed I would never strike back. I thought about the early days when we first moved in. I had believed this would be a new beginning, a place where my daughter and I could heal. Claudia turned it into a power game. That car in the garage wasn't just occupying physical space, it was a symbol of the authority she wanted to brand onto my family. And if I stayed silent any longer, it wouldn't be just parking space I'd lose. I'd lose my daughter's belief that her father could protect home. I went back inside and closed the door, but Claudia's laughter still echoed across. Inside me, a fire ignited. Not a flare of rage, but a cold, unwavering resolve. I had let her overstep long enough. Tomorrow, everything would change. My patience had reached its absolute limit, and beyond that point, there was only retaliation. I sat quietly in the garage, the yellow light casting down on the cold tile floor. In my hand, the garage remote felt unbearably heavy, an object so mundane, yet in this moment, it seemed like the only tool capable of restoring justice. I gripped it tightly, my knuckles pale. Every soft press, every clicking sound echoed in my head like a reminder that my patience had reached its final threshold. How many times had I tried to reason with Claudia, asking her to remove the Mercedes from this space? How many times had I swallowed my anger to keep the peace in front of my daughter? And in return, I received only mockery, public disdain, and the hollow laughter of her and her friend. It all closed in like a net, as if forced me into accepting that her power had become an unspoken law. In that moment, I knew only retaliation could end this arrogance. Not retaliation through empty arguments, but through actions strong enough to show her that her control no longer held. Claudia believed I would remain silent forever, that I wouldn't dare step outside the fence she had drawn around me, and that misplaced confidence would become my weapon. I remembered my daughter's eyes at the party, when she glanced at me as if to ask whether I would keep enduring. That child didn't need a father who bowed to injustice. She needed an anchor to prove fairness could still exist. That thought surged through me like electricity, igniting a fierce resolve. I wasn't doing this for myself. I was doing it to protect her belief that dignity should never be priced by silence. The plan formed in my mind with cold precision. I would lock the garage, trapping Claudia's Mercedes inside. No warning, no negotiation, just decisive action. She had so confidently declared that I wouldn't dare do anything, and I would make sure the entire neighborhood saw just how wrong she was. I pictured the rage on Claudia's face when she found her car locked in the very place she had claimed as a trophy. I imagined her scream, the pounding on the garage door, and the frustration when her HOA title failed to command obedience this time. That vision brought me a sense of calm, like a wound that had a chance, finally, to be closed. In my mind, Claudia's words echoed, "You should be grateful my car is in your garage." Those words had once made my chest tighten, but now they fueled me. It was time to return the favor with a lesson she would never forget, not in word, but in action. The truth was, all false power has limit, and that limit for her would be this garage door. I stood up, walked outside, and looked into the darkness blanketing the street in front of my house. The steady hum of insects pulsed in sync with my heart. In that moment, I realized I no longer felt afraid, no longer suffocated by the looming shadow of the HOA. I freedom, a sense of release, knowing I had finally made the decision to act. That night, I placed the remote beside my bed, like a promise for tomorrow. A promise that there would be no more days of watching arrogance overtake the roof of my own home. And as I closed my eyes, I knew this sleep would be different. It would no longer be a sleep weighted with frustration. It would be a sleep that readied me for the explosion of morning, when I would finally step beyond the boundary of patience. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The air outside still carried a trace of cold mist, but inside me, the fire from the night before was burning strong. I walked out to the garage. The silver Mercedes was still parked shamelessly in place, like a smirk that refused to fade. Without hesitation, I pressed the button. The steel door slid down and shut with a harsh, final slam. The sound echoed in waves, like an irreversible sentence. I locked it from the outside, turning the key hard until the click rang out sharp and clear. Within minutes, Claudia appeared. She stormed across the street, her blonde hair disheveled, her face flushed with rage. She screamed, her shrill voice tearing through the quiet air. "You locked my car in? Open it right now." Curious neighbors peeked out their doors. A few windows slid open and whispers spread like fire through dry grass. I stood in the yard, the remote still in my hand, eyes fixed on Claudia. I spoke, calm but weighty, like stone. Your car took over my garage without permission. I'm just doing what's necessary to restore peace in my own home. Claudia stormed up, jabbing a finger at my face, her hand trembling with fury. You're going to pay for this. You have no idea what's coming. I'll turn this entire community against you, she shouted. But I knew I had already severed the cord that had kept my head bowed for so long. I pulled the suitcase I'd packed the night before. Its wheels clacked sharply against the tiled ground, louder than any retort. I looked directly at Claudia, the corner of my mouth lifting into a faint, cold smile, and I delivered the line that left the gathered crowd stunned. I'm going on vacation for 10 days. Let your car stay right there. Consider it a decoration. Before the words had even faded, whispers rippled through the street. Someone covered their mouth to muffle laughter, and another turned away to hide their grin. Claudia's frozen for a moment, eyes wide, face burning with rage. Then she erupted, shrieking in front of everyone. You bastard! You'll regret this for the rest of your life. Her voice cracked and screeched with fury, but this time, no one joined in. No one backed her up. There was no need for me to say anything else. With each step I took toward the end of the street, dragging my seat behind me, Claudia's screams followed like a bitter soundtrack. But to me, every note sounded like proof of For so long, she had reveled in absolute power, grown used to seeing others lower their heads. Now, she was the one trapped in the very cage built from her own arrogance. A few residents stood leaning against the fence, their eyes filled with a mix of emotion. There was surprise, a hint of satisfaction, and a new kind of courage as they watched someone do what they had never dared to consider. I knew that, in their minds, a large part of Claudia's image just collapsed. I opened the car door, placed the suitcase in the trunk, and then settled into the driver's seat. I didn't look back, but I could still feel the chaos behind me. Claudia slamming her hands against the garage door, high heels clapping furiously against the concrete, her mouth pouring out bitter words. All of it only made her more of a spectacle in the eyes of the neighbor. Before driving off, I glanced into the rearview mirror. That scene would be etched into the memory of the entire community. Claudia, the ever-arrogant HOA president, now powerless in front of a cold steel door. The silver Mercedes gleamed behind the locked frame, unmoving, like a symbol of arrogance held captive. I drove slowly out of the neighborhood, a sense of relief expanding in my chest. For the first time in weeks, thought of the garage didn't make my stomach twist. I knew this act would come with consequences. Claudia wouldn't let it go easily. But I also understood something clearly now. Only a strike like this could expose her for what she truly was, and make the whole street see it too. On the highway heading toward the outskirts, I exhaled deeply. I thought about my daughter, about what she would learn from this story. She needed to see that people can choose silence, but staying silent too long only turns you into a target. And I wanted her to understand that sometimes resistance isn't just a right, it's a responsibility. I pictured Claudia again as the garage door slammed shut, that haughty posture twisted into a fit of useless rage and screaming. It was the perfect image of how false power crumbles, when someone who thrives on control finds herself unable to control a thing. As the car blended into the stream of traffic, I turned on some soft music, letting my mind settle. Part of me stayed alert, knowing Claudia would try to strike back in the days ahead, but another part felt calm, because I had done what needed to be done. I had proven that patience has limits, and once that line is crossed, no one can impose themselves on me again. Behind me, I left a neighborhood in uproar. The story of the car locked inside the garage would surely spread through every household, every dinner table, every meeting, and I believed deep down that everyone would remember that morning when Claudia Veyron tasted, for the very first time, what it felt like to be powerless. If it were you, would you have guts to leave for 10 days while a Karen was trapped with her car in your garage? Claudia didn't miss the chance to turn her outrage into another performance. The moment I left, she began to act. The Mercedes trapped inside the garage seemed to strip her of her composure. On the first day, I heard she called a locksmith. The man stood before the steel door, tools in hand, his posture confident, until he saw the clearly posted documents on the wall, certifying the garage as my private property. He simply shook his head. Sorry, there's nothing I can do. This isn't a stuck door. It's the homeowner's property. If I touch it, I'm facing legal trouble. Claudia lost her voice echoing through the neighborhood. He locked up my car, and you're all just going to stand there? I'm the HOA president. I'm telling you to open it. The locksmith stepped back, unwilling to escalate the situation. He responded calmly, you may be the HOA president, but those documents say you have no rights here. I'm not breaking a lock for something that's against the law. Then he left, leaving Claudia frozen on the spot. On the second day, Claudia still refused to back down. She called the police. 2 officers showed up at the house, and residents poured out to watch like it was a festival. Claudia flared flailed her arms, speaking dramatically like a victim of injustice. "My car is being illegally held. I demand you force him to open the garage." The officers listened calmly, then reviewed the paperwork. When they reached the section on property rights, they exchanged a glance. One of them spoke. "There's no basis for intervention. This garage is entirely owned by the purchaser, and there's no clause granting you access." The words hit Claudia like a bucket of cold water. She stood still, face going pale, then flushing red with humiliation. "You're taking his side? Don't you see he's destroying the reputation of this whole community?" One of the officers answered evenly, "We're not taking sides. We stand with the law, and the law is clear. You don't have the right to ask us to open that garage." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors covered their mouths, others laughed openly. For the first time, Claudia no longer held the upper hand. Flustered, she shouted, "You'll regret siding with him. I'll sue. I'll make this right." But the threat fell flat. The officers gave a polite nod, stepped back into their cruiser, and drove off, leaving Claudia alone in her public embarrassment. When I got the message from a neighbor, I simply sat in my hotel room, sipping coffee in silence. I pictured Claudia yelling in the street, calling for help that no one was willing to give, while the steel garage door remained untouched. A rare calm settled over me. This wasn't just personal retaliation. It was proof that perceived authority does not outrank the law. In the days that followed, Claudia continued to spiral. People said she tried calling 2 more locksmiths, but both refused after seeing the posted document. She even reached out to a few private security personnel, but they also shook their heads. They made it clear, "This isn't a public, it's private property. We're not authorized." Each rejection landed like a hammer blow on the reputation Claudia had always flaunted. The community slowly turned the trapped Mercedes into a running joke. Children pointed at it when they passed by, and adults gossiped. The story spread so fast that it became the main topic over morning coffee and porch conversation. The image of Claudia, the woman who once demanded compliance, now powerless in front of a garage door, gave many people a quiet sense of satisfaction. I knew Claudia wouldn't give up easily. She had more trick. But right now, the truth was undeniable. No title was powerful enough to bend the law to her will, and her desperation, as each plea for help failed, was the beginning of her downfall. Claudia refused to accept every door she knocked on had been slammed shut. When the police left and the crowd hadn't yet dispersed, she broke into a fit of wailing, as if the whole world had betrayed her. Her sobs mingled with a stream of insults, some hurled at me, others thrown at the neighbors watching. "You're all cowards. You're letting a newcomer destroy this community. I'll remember every face here," she screamed, her tears streaking through smudged makeup, carefully crafted image of authority crumbling in front of everyone. Someone chuckled. Another shook their head in disbelief. An old woman, silent during the entire HOA meeting, whispered, "What kind of president cries in the street like a child?" The murmurs multiplied, and each comment was another pin through Claudia's map. The more she yelled, the more distorted she became. In her panic, Claudia kept shouting my name, even though she knew I was long gone. "He thinks he's won? I'll crush him. I'll get my dignity back." But her words no longer carried threat. They were the hollow cries of someone backed into a corner. People no longer feared her. What remained was a strange mix of pity and ridicule. The next day, I received a text from a friendly neighbor. It said simply, "The whole neighborhood's talking about the silver car stuck in your garage. It's become a joke." I laughed out loud as I read it, picturing groups of residents stopping by the driveway, pointing at the locked door, swapping story. What once was Claudia's shining symbol of prestige had now become the backdrop for neighborhood comedy. The kids in the neighborhood even gave the Mercedes a new name, the imprisoned car. They gathered in front of the garage, pretending to argue over who was brave enough to sneak into four-wheeled prison. Their bright laughter echoed across the street, unintentionally turning Claudia's fury into a public foment. The adults didn't miss the chance to retell the incident as a comedy. At a tea party, one woman sighed. Claudia was always preaching about class, and now her car has to squat in someone else's garage like an unwanted guest. Laughter erupted. The name Claudia was no longer tied to authority. It had become synonymous with an unprecedented farce. Day by day, Claudia's humiliation swelled. When she passed by a group of neighbors, she was met with stifled laughter and whispered remarks. Someone joked, "How's your silver car holding up?" then turned away, grinning. What used to be hesitation had morphed into open amusement. No one feared retaliation anymore. They had seen for themselves that the title of HOA president couldn't save her from the truth. From the house where I was vacationing, I kept receiving updates like these, and I understood that the cracks in Claudia's power were now unmistakable. I didn't need to be there to fight, because the small, decisive act I'd taken had become the spark for a shift in the whole community. People were beginning to realize that Claudia was never untouchable. As for Claudia, once the self-declared guardian of civility, she had now become the embodiment of arrogance months in captivity. The silver Mercedes, once her pride, had turned into undeniable proof of her failure. And the story kept spreading through the neighborhood, becoming the centerpiece of every gathering, a tale both comical and quietly sobering. I closed my phone and smiled. Claudia had tasted something she never imagined, being seen by an entire community as a joke, and within me, a wave of calm spread, because I knew the power dynamic had shifted. This time, no one looked at her with reverence. They looked at her with contempt. 10 days passed faster than I expected. When I returned, the afternoon sun stretched across the narrow road leading into the neighborhood. Before I could even rest, I received news that Claudia was calling for an emergency meeting at the community hall. A neighbor sent a message. She says you broke the rules and is making everyone attend. I simply smiled, picked up my file bag, and walked in with the attorney I had arranged in calm and composed. The hall was. Claudia stood in the center of the room, her bright-colored suit like a declaration that she still held power. Her voice pierced the air, sharp and echoing. This man unlawfully locked my car in his garage. Such outrageous behavior is a serious violation of community regulation. A resident like him cannot be tolerated. There were scattered nods, but also uncertain glances. She was throwing everything she had into rallying one last wave of support. I stepped into the center of the room, pulled out a chair, and sat beside my lawyer. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just waited for Claudia to finish her performance before rising to my feet. I opened the bag, pulled out a stack of documents, each one clipped neatly. My lawyer placed a hand on the table and said firmly, "These are the property ownership certificates, clearly stating that the garage is under the exclusive control of my client. No individual, not even the HOA president, has the right to use it without permission." The room fell silent. I stepped forward and placed copies of the documents on the long table in front of everyone. Claudia Veyron didn't just occupy my garage. She entered it without consent. That is the actual unlawful act, and everyone here deserves to know the truth. My voice was steady, every word slicing through the facade she had worn. Claudia's face turned pale, but tried to push back. "He's making this up. I did it to preserve the value of the neighborhood. No one wants to live next to someone who doesn't understand the rule." Her voice faltered, rushed, and was uneven, but now her words carried no weight. A middle-aged resident stood and asked bluntly, "If you really did it for the community, why did you park your personal car in someone else's garage? We've heard plenty of explanations, but never seen proof. He has the papers." The question struck like an arrow through Claudia's crumbling defense. Others murmured, "She broke into his house," and still blames him. The shift in atmosphere was unmistakable. The facade of false consensus shattered. A soft chuckle came from a corner of the room and quickly spread. I didn't need to say anything more. My lawyer simply stated one final time, "If Ms. Veyron continues to make false accusations, we will file this case in court. Unlawful entry is a criminal offense, not to mention the civil liability." After my attorney finished speaking, the atmosphere in the room shifted drastically. Claudia's face froze, her eyes darting as if searching for an escape, but no one was reaching out to save her anymore. In the past, a single word from her would trigger a chorus of nods. This time, the heavy silence stretched on like an unspoken verdict. A man seated mid-row stood up, his tone calm but loud enough to be heard throughout the room. "We've gotten used to Mrs. Veyron speaking for all of us, but today, for the first time, I see clear documentation. The garage is private property, so what meaning do her accusations even have?" He looked directly at Claudia, and she lowered her head, unable to maintain her usual air of superiority. A young woman near the window joined in, her eyes lit with a long-suppressed anger. "You made me take down my Christmas lights because you said they were flashy. I wanted to object back then, but I stayed silent. Now I realize we've let you go too far." A few voices echoed with quiet, "That's right," as whispers turned into open affirmation. Claudia tried to hold her ground, her voice trembling. "Everything I've done was to preserve the value of this neighborhood. Without me, this place wouldn't be what it is today." But instead of support, her words drew scoff. An older man let out a dry laugh. "Preserving value by taking over someone else's garage? If that's your definition, then this community's value is nothing but a bad joke." Silence returned once again, but it was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence of people looking Claudia straight in the eye. Every gaze now held. There was no admiration left for her to cling to. I remained seated, saying nothing more because the truth was doing all the talking. My attorney closed the file, his voice crisp. "If Mrs. Veyron continues with these accusations, we will proceed with legal action. The evidence speaks for itself." That warning struck like final blow to Claudia's crumbling authority. She gripped the edge of the table, face cycling from flushed red to ashen pale. Everything that once worked in her favor had turned against her, exposing someone spiraling out of control on the very stage she had built. I noticed the corners of a few mouths turning upward, unable to hide their satisfaction any longer. A middle-aged woman stood up and faced front of the room. "We've stayed silent for too long, letting one person turn themselves into the law. Today, We need to make it clear. Respect doesn't come from a title, it comes from behavior. And Mrs. Veyron has lost it all. Her statement rang out like a hammer striking down the wall that had shielded Claudia. I stayed seated, listening as each isolated voice became part of a rising wave. One person recalled an unfair fine. Another brought up moments when Claudia had mocked them in public. Long-buried frustrations found their release, all converging on one truth: the unmasking of Claudia. She kept screaming, "This is betrayal! You'll all regret turning against me." But the words rang hollow, stripped of all weight. Each attempt to reclaim control only made her voice sound more feeble, exposing the fragility beneath her fury. I watched the scene unfold with a calm heart. I didn't need to bring Claudia down. She was doing that herself, unraveling under the weight of her own hysteria. And the community, after years of being led by fear, had finally begun to see her for what she truly was. After my accusations were backed by official documents, the atmosphere in the hall shifted completely. The hesitation was gone, and residents began standing up one after another, their eyes no longer filled with fear but with long-suppressed indignation. A man in the front row was first to speak, his voice trembling but firm. "She once forced my family to take down all our Christmas lights because she claimed they were too gaudy. We complied out of fear of being fined, but in truth, it was just a way for her to flex personal power." A young woman stood next, clutching a small purse, her voice heavy with a frustration she had never expressed. "She sent my family a warning letter because our small dog barked too loudly one afternoon. I had to pay a fine that made no sense, while other homes with large dogs were never warned. It's clear she selectively targeted people to make their lives harder." A wave of murmured agreement rippled through the room. One voice ended, another began. It was as if the room had been freed after years of being forced into silence. Frail, elderly man leaned on his cane and slowly walked to the center, his raspy voice filled with quiet authority. "I've lived here for over 15 years. I've never seen anyone rule with such tyranny. From criticizing my house paint as too worn, forcing me to change it, fining me planting flowers in my yard, every act was a..." The tension in the room rose higher. Then a tall black man stood up, his voice burning with outrage. "She always targeted us just because we don't fit her idea of elite. My family was fined for leaving an old car in the driveway for 2 days, while wealthier families leave whole fleets on the street and never hear a word. This isn't community management, it's discrimination." The room erupted with agreement. People nodded so hard their chairs creaked. The looks aimed at Claudia were no longer seeking leadership, casting judgment. She stood frozen, trying to maintain composure. But her trembling hand clenched the water glass so tightly that her red lipstick left a deep stain on the rim. A previously quiet middle-aged woman also stood, her tone bitter. "You once told me I wasn't qualified to live here because I'm a nurse, not a business owner or a lawyer. I cried in silence because I felt worthless. Now I see I wasn't alone. You've done this to many others too." Voices continued, one after another, like a rising tide. Each accusation added a new piece to the complete portrait of Claudia, a manipulator who hid behind the HOA title to spread fear and enforce false standards that served only her ego. I sat silently watching. I didn't need to say anything more because the community had finally found its voice. They had reclaimed the courage they had been forced to bury, and I knew that from this moment on, Claudia was no longer a symbol of authority, but the center of a reckoning. Claudia stood at the center of the hall, her face stripped of its usual arrogance. She tried to hold her head high, but her shoulders trembled slightly, and her hand gripped the edge of the table for balance. Her voice cracked, trembling like a plea for help rather than a declaration. "Everything I did was for the value of this neighborhood." The words echoed, hollow, carrying no weight. Those who once silently followed her now looked on with cold eyes. No one believed in those worn-out phrases anymore. A scoff came from the back row, then silence as everyone turned to look, not out of fear, but in anticipation of what would happen next. Claudia swallowed hard, repeating the same line like someone trapped in her own rhetorical snare. "Kept this place upscale. I protected the standard." But the more she spoke, the more out of place she became. No one chimed in, no familiar nods, only blunt, disdainful stares. A middle-aged resident stood up, voice steady and clear. "True value isn't forcing others to live by your standard. True value is mutual respect, something you never understood." The words cut through the air like a sharpened blade. Immediately, applause erupted, rippling across the hall. First, just a few, then the entire room joined in. The sound echoed not from fear, but from years of pent-up frustration finally unleashed. Claudia staggered, her eyes wide as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She had grown used to praise, to watching the whole community bow their heads. Now she faced a complete reversal. The clapping grew louder, drowning out every desperate attempt she made to regain footing. In that moment, Claudia was no longer the proud HOA president, but a figure exposed, bare under the light. I sat silently, watching it all unfold, no need to add a single word. I had done my part. The rest was the community unshackling itself. I saw an elderly woman, long quiet, joining the applause, her eyes lit up as if reclaiming long-lost justice. A young couple stood fully upright, clapping without pause, their faces barely hiding their satisfaction. Claudia tried to speak again, but each attempt was met with louder clapping. She faltered, frozen, lips trembling but unable to form another word. Finally, she collapsed into her chair, eyes blank, as if she too realized her false throne had collapsed before everyone's eye. The hall buzzed like an impromptu celebration, not for one person, but for an entire community that had just broken free. Satisfaction was etched into every smile, every round of applause that lingered long after Claudia had bowed her head. No one saw her as a leader anymore, only as the shadow of a I stepped outside, letting the community have that moment for themselves. What rose within me wasn't pride in a personal victory, but a deep relief that people had finally seen the truth for themselves. And I knew, from this point on, Claudia would never reclaim the power she once held. Have you ever witnessed someone in power lose all authority in front of a community? The day Claudia was officially removed by the HOA board, the neighborhood felt as though a weight had been lifted. The meeting was called urgently, just days after her public downfall. There were no more cheers, no more proud strides in her signature light-colored suits. Claudia sat hunched in the back of the room, face blank. When the decision was read aloud, she didn't stand to protest. She didn't have the strength to shout like before. It all ended in heavy silence, broken only by the firm applause of the residents. The silver Mercedes remained in my garage for a while longer, as Claudia no longer had the will to reclaim it. People passing by often pointed at it, treating it like a monument to failure. The car that once symbolized pride, once served as her personal yardstick of value, now stood as undeniable proof that arrogance comes with a price. Children still called it the imprisoned car, giggling whenever they walked past. No one feared Claudia anymore. All they saw was the ruin of someone who had dragged herself into disgrace. One afternoon, I sat on the porch with my daughter, sunlight dancing on her hair. She looked at me, eyes sparkling, then smiled. "Dad, things really did change after all." I smiled back, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said, "They did." Sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom, from a well-timed pushback. She nodded, her face brighter than ever. I knew this moment would stay with her, etched as a lesson in conviction. I realized then that this wasn't just my personal victory. It was a turning point for the entire community. For years, they had lived under control, believing silence was the only way to stay safe. But when one person stood up, when the truth came to light, the whole neighborhood rediscovered a voice they thought they had. Claudia gradually faded from the conversation. She moved out of the neighborhood a few weeks later, carrying with her a shame that couldn't be erased. People didn't care much about her anymore because they had found something more important, the belief that no one is above the law or above another's dignity. I looked back on the journey, from the moment I first found her car in my garage to the moment I locked that door without hesitation. It all began with restrained patience, but ended with necessary defiance. That lesson wasn't just for me, for anyone who ever thought they had to endure in silence. Because the truth is, justice doesn't always arrive in grand buildings or loud trials. Sometimes it comes in the moment when an ordinary person dares to say, "Enough." And as night fell, I sat beside my daughter, a deep calm settling in. I knew then that the most valuable thing wasn't defeating Claudia, but letting my child witness the meaning of resolve, that everyone has the right to preserve their dignity, and sometimes one decisive act is all it takes to change an entire community. In the days following Claudia's departure, the neighborhood gradually regained a peace that everyone had long thought was lost. The most noticeable change was in the atmosphere, where once neighbors to themselves spoke in hushed tone, wary of scrutinizing eyes and absurd warning letters. Now they were far more at ease. The man at the end of the block, who rarely stepped outside, began waving hello each morning. The woman who often walked her dog now smiled, paused to ask after me and my daughter. Those simple greetings, those seemingly small nods of acknowledgement carried a greater meaning. People were no longer afraid, no longer bowed beneath the shadow of the HOA that Claudia had constructed. My daughter noticed the change too. One afternoon, as we strolled through the neighborhood, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Dad, everyone's friendlier now." I feel so much lighter, I only nodded, a deep sense of pride welling up inside me. I knew the change wasn't just in the air, It was in the spirit of a community that had been stifled far too long and was now slowly beginning to breathe again. Another HOA meeting was held afterward, this time without Claudia seated at the head of the table. Instead, people actually came together to discuss things, free of the old charade where one person dictated and the rest nodded in reluctant agreement. Diverse opinions were voiced, debates sparked, disagreements surfaced, but what mattered was that everyone was heard. It was a rare sight, yet it stood as proof that the community had finally reclaimed its voice. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't mention Claudia. I spoke only about the importance of mutual respect. Every rule, every agreement only holds meaning when it's rooted in genuine consent, not fear. Heads nodded, and a few people even smiled, as if they had finally woken from a long, bad dream. For my part, I took away something profound. The arrogant may sit high for as long as they please, but all it takes is one timely locked door for their counterfeit throne to collapse. Claudia had believed that her title, her luxury car, and the looming power of the HOA would shield her forever, but it all crumbled in a moment. When the truth was laid bare and the community stopped staying silent, one decisive act, seemingly small, had the power to shift everything. I looked at my daughter and thought about what she would remember. Not the image of me locking a car in a garage, but the meaning behind it, the courage to stand up when dignity is crossed, the resolve to defend one's boundaries so no one could ever trample them again. That lesson, I believe, she'll carry with her for life, like a lantern to guide her whenever she faces injustice. The neighborhood still had its minor disagreements, petty arguments, but no one could impose their voice over everyone else anymore. People could argue passionately over paint colors or landscaping choices, but in the end, they laughed together because now they were truly neighbors, no longer subjects under someone's rule. And to me, that was the true victory. Not Claudia leaving in disgrace, not the silver Mercedes becoming a joke, but the fact this community had reclaimed its sense of equality. One locked door, one decisive choice, had opened a new path for everyone. Looking back, I see the whole journey as a mirror reflecting exactly what happens in a community when power falls into the hands of someone who abuses it. From the moment I first discovered the silver Mercedes arrogantly parked in my garage to the sight of Claudia Veyron trembling before the HOA board, the story had completed a full circle, beginning with intrusion, escalating through defamation, rising into confrontation, and ending with the downfall of someone who thought herself center of everything. And somewhere within that circle found the strength of resolve, while the community found the voice it had long been forced to press. What mattered wasn't that a car sat locked in a garage for 10 days, but that the entire neighborhood witnessed how one seemingly small action could shake an entire system built on fear. Claudia had crafted her power through silence, turning the title of HOA president into a tool of control. But once the truth came to light, everything she had used to dominate others became chains that bound her instead. Her image, screaming, hurling insults in vain outside a locked garage and later crumbling in the meeting hall, was not just personal vindication for me, proof that so-called power without a foundation of fairness is nothing more than a castle built on sand. The greatest lesson I learned is that silence never guarantees lasting safety. People endure because they believe staying quiet will peace, but in reality, it only makes the oppressor stronger. Only when one person dares to stand up does the rest begin to realize they can do the same. I'm no hero, just a regular resident, but I chose not to back down. And that choice became the spark that helped an entire neighborhood claim justice. I also came to understand that the standards Claudia constantly preached were nothing more than a veil for contempt and exclusion. She believed luxury cars, fancy homes, and the HOA title would command submission. But the real value of a community doesn't lie in those polished surfaces. It lies in mutual respect, in people defending their boundaries, and in their ability to stand together against oppression. Once awakened, those fake layers peel away fast. For my daughter, everything she witnessed became a profound lesson. She saw her father refuse to bow, watched her neighbors slowly reclaim their voices, and, more importantly, she learned that justice isn't some distant ideal. Justice lives in every decision we make, every time we choose to confront wrong instead of avoiding it. And I believe, as she grows older, this memory will serve as a compass, guiding her to protect herself and everything that stands for what's right. When the community burst into collective applause at the truth, I knew that moment marked a turning point. No one had to lower their gaze in fear of being written up. No one had to whisper out of worry that a warning letter might arrive. Instead, there was openness, genuine greetings, and meeting truly focused on shared interests. It all began when people realized false authority only exists when everyone allows it to. So the final lesson I take away isn't just for me or this neighborhood. It's for anyone who has ever felt oppressed, ever felt diminished in the very place that should have been their home. The arrogant may sit high for as long as they like, but all it takes is one decisive decisive act, one well-timed pushback, and that counterfeit throne collapses. And when it does, what remains isn't just satisfaction, but liberation for an entire community. I share this story not to reopen wounds, but to remind us that fairness sometimes begins with what seems like a small act. Never underestimate the power of saying, "That's enough." Because from that moment on, darkness loses its grip and light has a chance to return, brighter, steadier, and here to stay.